On! You won't believe what just happened. Wait, what happened? I just got absolutely ruined by this blast of paint out of nowhere. Can you believe it? Who would even do that? Well, I did get laughed at by some kids before it happened, but, well, why didn't you tell them off? Huh? That sounds like some complaining baby talk right there. What, are you too weak to stop them? Sure sounds like it. But on! Give me a break. Also, blue is not your color. Colin Gifford Brooke wrote this essay in Bad Ideas About Style, Usage, and Grammar. Reading the title, I mistakenly thought the passive was referring to something along the lines of maybe this? Or perhaps that. Or it could possibly be... No, it's none of that. So, what is the passive voice? Well, you can't bring it up without the active voice, both of which are grammatical constructs utilized in languages such as English and Latin. You can identify them by things such as the ending of the verbs, along with how the verb is used. The voices differentiate in how the subject relates to the verb. The active has the subject verbing, while the passive has the subject being verbed. To add on to this, I tend to remember this better by understanding the subject is being verbed by or from something, whether or not the sentence actually includes it or not. For an example, if I tried to explain to my friend why I'm so deprived of sleep today, I could say in the active, I stayed up all night drawing. Or I can say in the passive, this drawing kept me up all night. When you're using the passive, you don't even need the topic to be present, as the verb and indirect object gives sufficient information.
The drawing needed to be done.
In terms of how the voices are perceived, the essay uses a quote from the Book of Writing Styles, Strunk and White, to explain the characterization of the active voice, such as
direct, vigorous, bold, concise, forcible, lively, and emphatic. And that's a whole lot of praise for a grammatical construct. And that makes sense, since it's so commonly used universally that it deserves that kind of respect. And the passive? Weak, indirect. And this kind of contrast makes the passive voice sound undesirable for whatever reason. Yet I can understand this perception nevertheless, as this voice implies a sense of acceptance for whatever the subject is experiencing. Nonetheless, I like to keep our solid definition as the active having the subject influencing, and the passive where the subject is being influenced. With that, we can get into the ways a passive voice is used. One grammatically convenient way to use the passive voice is through sentence cohesion. Sentence cohesion is the flow of sentences from one to the next. We may not think about it often, but it really does wonders when we're familiar with writing paragraphs. Writing singular sentences can be effectively direct all they want, but you'll see what I mean by a need for cohesion when using more than one. Dude, there was a big explosion of paint that splattered the streets in blue. These streets are owned by people who hate the color blue. Because the streets appear during the ending of the first sentence and the beginning of the second sentence, there is sentence cohesion, where it goes from the active voice in the first sentence to the passive voice in the second. In other words, the passive voice gives a proper balance to what was given to what is new information. If we tried to use the active voice for the second sentence, you'd get something like this. Dude, there was a big explosion of paint that splattered the streets in blue. Those who hate the color blue own these streets. Compared to the previous example used, there isn't as much sentence cohesion, since the already mentioned streets at the end of the first sentence is being treated as something to redefine in the second, when it was already defined in the first. Hence why it can sound so awkward, and it can make the readers work a little harder to find the connection between the two. Even if you isolated the sentence, it still doesn't sound as nice as passive's version. So the active does have its inefficiency in its effects, strengthening the importance of passives' voice synergy with actives. Another one of the uses Brooke dives into is its ability to obscure responsibility. Let's use the following example, starting with the active. You get explosions! You get explosions! Everyone gets explosions! Compared to, a series of explosions just occurred. But what caused them? The passive voice obscures the accountability from the source in question. Therefore, you're really only left with the outcome of the action. Not that this is an entirely bad thing, though. It's more gray when you take into consideration. On one hand, it can create indirect sentences, which can dwell into cryptic messages or certain humors, such as, mistakes were made! What have you done? Wouldn't you like to know?
As you can see, this on isn't exactly giving a direct answer, since she's answering passively. Nevertheless, its vagueness to such a chaotic scenario adds a sense of humor to the ridiculousness.
On an additional note, such vagueness makes the receivers open-minded on what the indirect object of the sentence could be referring to, making even a single sentence in passive effective for a cohesive link. By rephrasing a sentence in passive, it can be indirect enough to refer to any new points you make in an analysis that supports your claim. In fact, what I just did was a good example of that. By mentioning sentence cohesion at the start, even when I got into how the passive's indirectness is useful, I mentioned sentence cohesion once more here, linking to my prior explanation to what sentence cohesion was. And if you don't understand, just think of how you make a claim, grab your evidence, and analyze, before linking it back to the claim, even if whatever was in between wasn't completely related to the original claim, just by using the passive.
Assuming that makes sense, we can move on to the next function.
On the other hand, however, the passive voice's structure of obscuring the subject can downplay or hide the culprit committing a harmful action in writing, meaning readers could be reading about crimes or historical tragedies and not even get the full picture due to the natural implementation and function of the passive. There is a way this can be utilized for a somewhat opposite effect. Let's use the past scenario. What was that? I made a mistake! The active voice forces the subject because of its directness. Now, what if this on responded differently? Mistakes were made. Well, usually mischievous on likes to put explosives everywhere. Well, this on is easy to put the blame on herself. Maybe the other on could have done this then? See how because nice on used the passive voice, the receptive on became more open-minded to the possibilities involved in the situation, compared to just taking the initial direct answer that would have been in the active voice. In this timeline, receptive on is also able to accurately speculate the real culprit behind its explosion. The passive voice has a right to be critiqued for hiding the accountability the subject holds for its action, especially if the writer is using it to manipulate their readers. Yet, it's made clear this voice has more benefits than evil. From making natural to strategic sentence to multi-paragraph sentence cohesion to rephrasing a sentence to sound more nicely vague. It's already naturally important in grammar, so imagine just what we could do if we strategically use the passive voice. Why hard swallow the active voice with its imperfections when we can grow and embrace the passive for what it can fully bring, rather than fearing it? That's fair. Now, no one needs to think of just how useful the passive voice is, not as often as I think of the Roman Empire. At the same time, the passive voice should be respected as a grammatical style of writing that can be used strategically and naturally. The passive definitely is not weak, as it's no weakness for choosing to show the subject being influenced. It just comes down to the skill of the writer to utilize it to their benefit, whether it be for the good grammar or whatever they think makes their phrasing more effective. And with that in mind, this title is officially obliterated. And that's all I have to share on the passive voice. I'd like to thank Mr. Brooke for educating me to educate you on this argumented matter. I hope you have a nice day. Wait, What's that sound?